Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Zach Kacharski. I'm the executive editor at the Gazette. And thank you for taking time to join us for Iowa Ideas In-Depth Week focused on water quality. Today, we're going to have a conversation about some of the watershed approaches going on across the state. And also, before we begin, I'd like to thank Hertz Farm Management, who has sponsored this week's panels. And we have a short video clip to share from them at this time.
Hi folks, I'm Ryan Kay with Hertz Farm Management out of our Mount Vernon, Iowa office. I'm a farm manager. We are happy to sponsor the Iowa Idea Water Quality Week. Water is a valuable resource that agriculture plays an important role in managing. I'm excited to be on the panel this week looking into the impacts of animal waste on water quality. We have been helping landowners protect streams, rivers, and lakes over Hertz's 75 years in business. If you have any questions or just like to talk about water quality in agriculture, please feel free to reach out to our office at 319-895-8858 or visit hertz.ag. Thank you.
All right. Now to the panel discussion. I'd like to introduce the panelists briefly, and then I will have them talk a little bit more about their involvement in the various watersheds. So I'd like to introduce Theo Gunther, a Senior Research Program Development Coordinator with the Iowa Soybean Association, Mike Kuntz, the Utilities Environmental Manager with the City of Cedar Rapids, and John Norwood, a Polk County Soil and Water Conservation District Director, who's also working on a Blitz project over in Polk and Dallas counties. Thanks to each of you for taking time today. And I figure we could start. Mike, if you want to talk a little bit, you have the home field advantage in the Cedar. I'll start with you.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you for allowing the City of Cedar Rapids to join the panel. We appreciate this opportunity. My name is Mike Kuntz. I am a Utilities Environmental Manager, and utilities in Cedar Rapids is water treatment, producing the source water that the citizens use, wastewater treatment, and sanitation. And my role as environmental manager has to do with all the different regulations that we need to meet for our water quality. Especially, we have an NPDES permit to put our treated effluent back to the Cedar River, so I have responsibility for that. And then I also have some responsibility for our watershed programs and managing the activities that we're involved in there. So happy to be part of the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Theo, we'll go to you.
Hi, I'm Theo Gunther, Senior Program Development Coordinator at the Soybean Association. And my role is to help identify partners and develop projects that allow farmers to do on-farm research, support them in implementation of conservation practices, and work with them to identify what practices work best on their farms. So it's a broad program of in-house research that we do here at ISA, research and implementation, I guess. And that's what I focus on, trying to identify those new opportunities and get them out to farmers.
All right. Last but not least, John.
Hi, I'm John Norwood. I'm a Soil and Water Commissioner, as you mentioned, Zach, for Polk County, our capital county. We've got about 500,000 people that we represent. I'm one of 5 commissioners. Polk County is in central Iowa, for those not familiar with Iowa. And we are really at the bottom of 2 major river systems, the Des Moines River and the Raccoon River. There's 3 different branches, and we drain about 20 counties. So we are in a critical place in Iowa, and really excited to work on things that can really deliver transformational change. That's what I do with my consulting business, TBL Ventures. And so we're looking at business transformation and applying some of those principles to what we're trying to do in our watersheds.
All right. I figure for everybody who's participating, if you have questions that come up in the course of the conversation, please use the chat feature to put those in. Otherwise, I will start with a few questions that I had put together ahead of time, but we will jump to your questions in the chat as well. And I was curious, Mike, I'll start with you. The City of Cedar Rapids has been working for years, kind of on an approach that's become nationally recognized, forging relationships along the watershed. Can you talk about what it's been like, why that's been necessary, how it's helped, and what does it take to kind of forge relationships with both private and public partners along the watershed?
Yeah, sure. It's been an exciting, rewarding, challenging. For me personally, it's been great to be involved in this over the last, we've been really engaged in partnerships and in the watershed for 10 or more years now, ever since we were involved in stakeholder groups to help develop the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy. City of Cedar Rapids was a stakeholder in that. And so out of that grew relationships with agriculture, different groups that were also a part of that stakeholder group to develop that strategy. And so out of those early meetings and the development of what was happening with that strategy, relationships have been formed. And so we have been part of developing those and strengthening those relationships over time. And it's been rewarding. We've been able to meet farmers in their fields up in the watershed. We've been able to have farmers and ag groups come to Cedar Rapids and see what we do for water treatment and have them understand what our needs are of the river. And we go and understand what the farmers are doing on their land. And it's just been a really rewarding and educational experience to understand from our different perspectives how and why we rely on water and the unifying parts of one water approach to our water systems, how that really is tying us together. Cedar Rapids, as you know, is a huge agricultural developer or processor of corn and soybeans. And the watersheds we're in, those things are the primary commodity crop being grown around us. They're coming into our town, they're being developed, they're being shipped around the world. And so it's really been, from our perspective, a natural and correct relationship to partner up to see how we can accomplish our water quality goals and continue meeting our economic needs as well.
Well, and Mike, that's translated to not just partnerships working together, but also funding projects up into other communities, kind of outside of the city of Cedar Rapids limits. What's kind of been the thought to do that?
Yeah, so one of the things we've also been involved with over the years is watershed management authorities. And so City of Cedar Rapids is part of 3 watershed management authorities: the Middle Cedar Watershed Management Authority, the Lower Cedar Watershed Management Authority, and the one that's local to us, the Indian Creek Watershed Management Authority, which is a large creek that drains a large portion of Lynn County to the Cedar River. And so those collaborations, those coming together, those examining of what's going on with water drainage, with nutrients, with challenges that we see for nitrate to our drinking water, has kept us engaged and kept us asking, how can we help work on this large issue? It's complex. The nutrients in the Cedar River, of where it comes from, how it's there, and what weather patterns play a role, all of those things. And so these partnerships have brought many different stakeholders together, from agriculture, from government, from private NGOs, to talk about the different ways that we can work together to try to make a difference in water quality in Iowa. It's just been really exciting to do that.
Okay. Well, John, I wanted to kind of turn to you a little bit. You're working in the middle of a Blitz project that in recent coverage has been called a potential model for the state. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what you're doing and, kind of what you see the benefits of in the watershed.
Yeah, that's a great question. And a little background as to how the Blitz project got to be, and it's really a very systematic approach. One of the things that struck me or strikes me about Iowa is the scale of our agricultural system. I'm going to run off a few numbers here really quickly. We farm 23 million acres to corn and beans. We produce 50 million hogs a year. We talk a lot about 25 million hogs at any point in time, but a hog goes from a little baby to the market weight of 260, 280 pounds in 5 months. So 50 million hogs, if we thought about our hogs, and Chris Jones has pointed this out, in terms of people, we would be the most populous state in the country by far. So, and then we have, of the 23 million acres, 14 million acres are tiled. That means that's our ag plumbing. That's how the fields get drained in the spring. And of the 14 million, 6 million are controlled by something called drainage districts. And then this system, the economic system represents about $40 billion annually in output, agricultural output. And the land is worth 230, approximately, this is a low range, about $230 billion, all that ag land. So this is tremendous scale. This unit, if Iowa was its own country, we would be in the top 10 in the world, and we're only second behind California in terms of our total agricultural output. So if we want to begin to think about, well, how do we make an impact on the water quality here in Iowa, we got to be thinking, what can we do that scales up? And so that's where the idea of the Central Iowa Water Quality Infrastructure Project, is a long word. That came out of some thinking that I did, talking with some others. Charlie Schaefer with AgriDrain was one of the first people I was talking to, thinking about how do we deliver these things, not one at a time, but many at a time. So we're going from 1 or 2 at a time to 50 and then 100. And so the basic idea is that whether we're talking about the water quality, the ag plumbing infrastructure, or soil health, cover crops, or land use, altering some of the land use, the 23 million acres, there's probably 2.5 million that we should be doing something else with. We got to think about what's scalable. And so that process that you're starting to see unfold with the Central Iowa Water Quality Project comes at the solutions using a new technical, marketing, organizational, and funding approaches. We have to rethink the essential way we're delivering these practices and these services and so forth. So it's a fundamental shift in thinking that's really exciting.
Well, and to talk a little about the specifics, you're doing buffers and bioreactors. I think the plan is for the first phase 51, and then scaling up to about 150. Is that correct?
Yeah. So we're gonna, just in Polk County alone, we're gonna more than double what the state's done in its entire history, because we're using a new approach. It's saturated buffers and bioreactors. And not because I think that's the solution, that's a part of the solution to our nutrient reduction. And we need to begin to do things that Theo has been talking about, the wetlands, filtered wetlands, the CREP funded wetlands. We have about 1,600 of those statewide that we've identified. We've only done a very small fraction. So we need to begin to think about how do we take that model that we just developed with the Central Iowa Water Quality Approach, and that gets applied to the 3,700 drainage districts we have in the state that control the 6 or 7 million acres that I talked about, all done voluntarily in my vision. But that gives you an idea of sense of where perhaps this all could go.
Well, and Theo, these projects start at the individual level. Can you talk a little bit about what goes into working with, a farmer or operator about figuring out what to do with their property, and is that something you make a strategic plan and take out a few pieces at a time, or how do you approach that?
Well, there's a long history of watershed plans throughout the state of Iowa. So starting with a focus on soil erosion decades ago, all the way up to now, where we're starting to include, there was a starting to quality, specifically nitrate and sediment reductions across the state. So now there's, I don't know the exact number, but dozens of watershed plans that have been developed recently. There's new siting tools that look at the watershed spatially and try and identify locations where practices could potentially be installed based on their geologic and geographic proximity to certain, or overlap with what's needed for specific practices, whether that's wetlands or saturated buffers or others. So there's lots of it's a target-rich environment out there. There's plenty of places that practices could be installed. What it also takes is, willing landowners, people that have an interest in the practice. It also takes available funding. So it's a combination of those things that actually lead to something happening on the ground. In the case of something like a erosion control structure, if we look at some of the things that have been installed historically, things like terraces, those are an obvious. There's obvious soil degradation that those are preventing, and that's why there's been a long history of willing landowners to put those in, public cost share to install those, and where water quality or where nitrate loss is a little less obvious, and there's not an on-farm benefit to some of those practices. So it takes a combination of those things. We have no shortage of places where practices could be installed, but it takes an overlap of those three things I mentioned to make it happen.
Well, and Theo, are you working with the willing participants? Are you helping to educate to hopefully bring them into the willing category, or how does that process start when you are doing that?
So we've tried a lot of different approaches in this state. There's no shortage of outreach information about bioreactors, saturated buffers. A practice that we've found has both wildlife and some water quality benefits are restored oxbows. Those are another edge of field practice that's being installed on private land. So there's plenty of information out there. There's been approaches trying to mail information to out-of-state landowners. There's been a history of watershed coordinators knocking doors in watersheds. Every different type of meeting has been tried. Meeting at the co-op, meeting at the conservation board office. There's plenty of different approaches that have been tried. So continuing to get that information out there and identifying those willing landowners, and then getting them through a viable process. Something that in Polk County that's interesting about that project is they've streamlined it. So rather than having to convince a landowner to do something after identifying that something could be done, they're making it more of an opt-in situation where all they have to do is say yes, and then make it easy for to line up the contractor to put all the pieces in place so that they can install a lot of them. So that's an interesting model, and I hope it could translate into making some of the other less effective, I guess, in historical terms, outreach methods, help make those a thing of the past. That way we're getting more people opting in and getting it done.
Okay. Well, John, and I see a question from Chad in the audience. Are the 50 farmers prearranged, or how did you, in terms of these first projects getting off the ground, how did they get signed up? Did you go off of most impact or most willing? How did you do that?
Those are great questions and really good background by Theo and Mike. And I want to emphasize a point that Mike made about a lot of this starts with relationships and building trust. So if you don't have trust and you don't have relationships, you're just not going to make a lot of progress. The next thing you have to have is you have to have a vision. You have to have a vision of what you want to do and try to get people involved and excited about the vision. So that's part of what led into the Polk County project. The third part of it is we were very intentional about what we wanted to do. And by intentional, I mean targeted. So we didn't wait for landowners to come to us. We went to them and we picked the highest value sites for those practices, the ones that we thought would have the best chance of success. And then we went out and we marketed. And, I think as Theo said, we have all sorts of history of stuff that frankly is pretty inefficient in the delivery. And it's inefficient in terms of the marketing of how you find the person. It's inefficient in terms of how you bundle what you want to do. And it's inefficient in terms of the economics of delivery, because if you ask every landowner to go find their own contractor, the contractors will tell you for the most part, they don't want to, they don't want to do one saturated buffer. They don't want to do one bioreactor. That's a side job for them. So it's targeted. It's turnkey. Theo talked about that. So the landowner doesn't have to go find the contractor. We already have that arranged. They just need to decide whether they want to buy in. In the case of our Polk County situation, the funding came both from the state and the local county. So the feds in that case were not set up yet. I hope we get the model updated so that they can begin to, with the federal dollars, help us drive these systematic approaches. That's another key part. And the final thing I would say is capacity. You know, we're not gonna, Theo was just talking to the Upper Raccoon WMA. That's like 1,800 square miles, I think, right, Theo? It's big. It's Mike, it's
Huge.
it's huge. And so one watershed coordinator, you know, we need those people, but they by themselves are not going to be able to deliver the systematic approaches that we're talking about. We need teams of people that are going to be able to, you know, get the flywheel going. This is the power of one. We figure out how to do it once, the flywheel starts going, and then you spin it off, and maybe you have every county that's leading an effort in their own county to deploy, you know, these kinds of approaches.
Well, John, not to dominate this conversation, but I am curious, how did you make the decision or get the funding from the county? What was the decision to fund this?
Well, the county, you know, my hat's off to the county supervisors and the team that has delivered this project. 3 people in particular, I want to call out: John Swanson, who works for the county, Keegan Colt, who works for the Ag Drainage Management Coalition, and then our own Tanner Pulls, who works for our Soil and Water District. Those 3 people have worked tirelessly. And then behind the scenes, we also have the Iowa Department of Agricultural people and the NRCS that really stepped up the plate. I mean, imagine all the design work. We went from 1 or 2 of these at a time. Now we got to do 50 and 100. I mean, people's hair on fire. So the reason the county stepped in part was because we were working on federal funding, and that kind of fell apart. It was like, well, the feds we're not used to doing it this way. It doesn't meet our particular standards. And so the state stepped in, and the county supervisor said, hey, we're a learning organization. We're going to learn how to do this stuff and de-risk it. And the county supervisor said, this is something, you know, we're really super concerned about our water quality. And so we got to figure out how to get these systems approaches rolling. So that's why they stepped in. The
farmer's share is covered, correct? So yeah, it's not
this case, and this is one of the issues with the edge of field. You know, typically these practices are a cost to farmer. When we talk about farmers, we really need to differentiate between a landowner and an operator. The operator is typically what we think of as the farmer, and the landowner is the person who owns the land, and often those are not the same people. And so if we're talking infrastructure, the plumbing, what we got to put in the ground, that's not the operator typically wanting to pay for that. So that's the landowner. And in this case, yeah, it was 100% cost of installation, and plus a participation fee that was tied to a temporary construction easement. So I think it was $1,000 per installation. And so this is just scratching the surface. This is just the start of how we get to 23 million acres.
Okay, Mike, I wanted to kind of transition to you. And earlier this year, Cedar Rapids and other partners were awarded $7 million, and I think with matching funds, it grew to around $17 million for watershed improvements. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about, I believe some of that is federal money, yes, and kind of what you're hoping to do with that, and the impact that you hope to see.
Yeah, so John and Theo are the experts working with agriculture. And so the city is always looking for, how can we come alongside? How can we help promote what's happening? Because we see the benefit of these practices that they're talking about. And so one of the ways we can do that is now that we have a full-time watershed coordinator on our staff, Mary Beth Stevenson, is go out there and look for opportunities. And the 2018 USDA Farm Bill, the RCPP program, had the opportunity to apply for funding. And one of the key ingredients in there that really got our attention was source water protection. 10% of the funds nationally are targeted to source water protection. And so we filled out, we applied for this funding opportunity and described how we were going to use the source water protection as a priority in this project, and to work on agricultural practices in the landscape that would help improve water quality in those areas. And so that was a big part of this project. And I believe one of the why we were funded is because of that focus on that. And so, yes, we were fortunate to be funded, and thanks to the work of our partners, IAWA was key. Iowa Soybean Association, DNR, Land O'Lakes Terra, among several others, that really helped us put together a nice funding opportunity that was awarded. So we're very excited about that. And we're excited to get started. It's a 5-year project, and you're correct. It's just over $17 million over that 5-year project. The direct benefit from the federal government is about just over $7 million. And all of that is targeted to landowners and farmers to put practices on the ground. I mean, that's what we're trying to do. So.
And Mike, are those going to be targeted? Are you going to go,
Yes.
John kind of identified specific properties?
Priority areas for this project are source water protection areas. So it's not just Cedar Rapids that relies on the Cedar River and its influence on our aquifer for drinking water, but there's several communities up in the middle Cedar watershed and the upper Cedar watershed that have source water challenges. There's farming communities with source water challenges, individual wells, there's small towns. And one of the partners we have is the city of Charles City. So source water protection from nitrate is a big focus of this project. And we're going to go into those areas that the DNR has identified and look for opportunities and bring resources, bring education, talk with farmers, talk with landowners, and say, hey, would you be interested in a practice here? We see this area as vulnerable, and that's going to be our approach. It's education, it's outreach, it's working with our other partners who are already working on the landscape to try to focus on that, and that's one of the keys to this project. And for Cedar Rapids, the whole area is a source water area. I mean, the Cedar River is a large area, it drains the Cedar Rapids. We rely on that influence that the river has on our aquifer. So for us, it's a win-win all the way through that watershed, wherever we can be of assistance to bring these resources to further getting these practices on the ground is a win for us, both for source water and a number of other things.
Well, and Mike, just to I would guess one of the other wins is to not necessarily have to spend as much money treating the water for nitrates.
Sure. That's one of the benefits we believe for our investment in the watershed is to not in the future have to build expensive nitrate treatment on our source water side. If we're able to be effective in the watershed and keep the nutrients there where the farmers need them and out of the river where they don't do anybody any good, that's a win-win for agriculture. It's a win-win for us. Absolutely. That's one of our key benefits, key goals of our projects.
Theo, I wanted to kind of go back to a point that John had made about operators and landowners. And I'm curious, as you're working, how often are they maybe out of sync with each other? Or how big of a challenge is that to maybe can find the landowners and convince them, or maybe help some of the operators on the land move forward with plans?
Good question, and it's site specific. No single farm operator has the same mix of owned and rented acres. No landowner is fits the exact same mold as the next landowner over. Other than that, they own land. They might have a different outlook. They might have different goals for their land. So it's hard to generalize in that regard. What we've tried to focus on is supporting people who are interested in more information. So if that's water testing, we have a water testing lab that we've done extensive stream and tile sampling analysis over the past 15 or more years. We've done that through a combination of different programs. That supports the landowners in targeted watersheds where we have funding to support that type of work, and also the farm operators if they're interested in that information. And so the other thing that we've tried to work on is for an infield practice like cover crops, working with farmers to, while they're implementing that or while they're experimenting with it, to help collect additional information. So if they're adopting cover crops, they oftentimes need to modify their tillage and fertilizer inputs. And so trying to collect data and look at different types of management, that how they affect yield, how they affect the system, and try to give that feedback to the operators, I guess. And then for the landowners, we've worked with any combination of people who have come to ask for more information, right? So if we've had farmers or operators, I guess, in the terminology we're using here, say I have a landowner that's interested, I'm a tenant that's interested in the sampling, can we work with them? And so it's hard to generalize, but we try to support people with the programs that we put in place, namely water sampling, where we have funding to support that, and then on-farm research to help with the learning curve when people try a new practice like cover crops.
Theo, has that made that an easier conversation? Some of this is, it takes time for everybody to learn and understand, and there are risks, or there's, a cost sometimes, but has it gotten easier with some of that data that you're collecting as you start, hey, look at this? Does that, influence change, or is it still, kind of site specific?
It's site specific. I think there's where we are now, there's farmers in every region of the state that, for example, with the example of cover crops, that have experience using it on a majority of all of their acres. So there's local resources, farmer resources, their peers, that they can look to understand how to best manage that practice. And that just wasn't the case 15 years ago. There's examples of farmers in every part of the state that are making that system work. And they're the best resource for their peers. We can collect information and do some basic on-farm research to try and gather some feedback on what happens on a specific field in a specific year, and try and aggregate that information, and that becomes another resource. But really, the big driver is the availability of resources, but also those resources of local peers. And we try and support those farmers that are ahead of the adoption curve as much as we can, and then point people who are interested in a practice towards our data that we house ourselves, but then also the local champions and people who have been doing it for years in those areas.
Okay. Mike, I had a question that came to me, and the question is the effect of the project that you explained, are you going to have measurable results? And John, I'm going to ask the same question to you, of you kind of the measurable results of the impact.
Yes, that is a challenge. It's a complex watershed. There's lots of land areas. There's variables that make that hard. But one of the things we're encouraged by is in the last project we just finished, we had a 5-year smaller focus. It was a 5 Huck 12 area, 135,000 acres or so. And one of the things we've included in our project is monitoring. And so over that 5-year period, we worked with Iowa ISA and Co College here in town to monitor 60 sites in those areas where we're putting the projects on the ground. And so the data is showing favorable results. We're seeing some what looks like reductions in nitrate and a little bit in phosphorus as well from the areas where cover crops are, or the areas where there's a bioreactor. And so we're optimistic that yes, in those target areas where you see an intensification of these practices being implemented, we can see the reductions, we can see the impact. It's having an effect in those small areas. But it's a huge watershed. We've mentioned that a couple of times. It's however many million square miles. And so that's millions of acres, or 1,000 square miles, it's millions of acres. And so I believe we're going to see results on those smaller scales where there's an intensification of the practice. The challenge is, how do we get these practices widespread across an area as big as the Middle Cedar watershed? I think that's our challenge. I know everybody on the panel agrees. How do we get more volunteers out there to join the effort, step up, give it a try? We're going to try to give those folks resources to step out there and help with that. But that's the challenge. That's really the challenge. But I do believe, and studies that Iowa State has done too show, there's definite reduction by using these practices we're talking about. You see the reductions in the tile water. You see from an outlet of a bioreactor, for instance. You see the reductions off the land where there's cover crops that have been implemented for a number of years and no-till. You see that less and less nitrate in the water that runs off. So to answer your question.
And John, I'm curious, measurable results are part of your project as well?
Yeah, they're measurable. And I think kind of a couple of thoughts I had for kind of a big picture here of what's going to move the needle on the water quality. So what we're talking about with the Central Iowa Water Quality Project, the infrastructure project, the bioreactors, saturated buffers, that's part of the ag plumbing. What Theo was just talking about was part of the cover crops and the soil health, and the two actually go together. And I've been up in, Emmitsburg the other week in Washington County, and on a Indigo Ag sponsored talk, listening to Paul Hawken, and people may not on this call, Zoom call here, understand what's the deal with the cover crops. And the cover crops do two things. They provide protection for the soil during the time when the main crops or primary crops are not in the field. So when Mother Nature rains, you're not just hitting the dirt and dislodging the soil particles. So that's one benefit. The other more important is the cover crops are really feeding the bugs in the soil, the microbial action. And it's the microbial action that builds the soil health and structure that allows the water to infiltrate and the crops to grow and so forth. And then you don't need to add as much anhydrous. We start reducing the inputs, and that's the double whammy of get the infrastructure right so it filters, and get the soil health right. And then the third part is what Larry Weber was talking about on Iowa Press the other day, where he was saying, we got to be smarter about where we decide to do certain things. So we have 400,000 acres of 2-year floodplain areas that we're trying to grow crops in, and it's not profitable. So we got to figure out other things to do there. And so if we do that, then we'll have a triple whammy of better, buffers and filtration. So those three things go together. As far as the monitoring, I want to make one other point, which is the monitoring is also about management. And if we set up our monitoring system correctly, and I want Polk County to be the first to do this, we monitor from a river level what comes into the county, what goes out of the county, and what we add ourselves. And if you talk to people like Chris Jones, we actually in Polk County, we drain 20 counties, but guess what? From a loading standpoint, we reduce nitrogen by about 25% on an annual basis. And then you scratch your head, well, how does that happen? That's Saylorville Lake. It's like a giant bioreactor, but the problem is that lake is then growing algae, and the algae is growing the microtoxins that then go down through the dam. And then the Des Moines Waterworks says, oh gosh, we got to shut off the water for half the year. So, the nitrate is an important component of what we need to do, and got to get that out. But the nitrate is actually leading to some other things that are harder to treat. The microtoxins are super hard to treat. You can't get those out with a conventional denitrification plant. So it's much bigger. The water quality issues are much bigger than just the nitrogen, and also the sediment going in the Saylorville Reservoir that's filling that up. That's probably several $1 million a year. And that's why we got to use the monitoring and the management system at the river level to help us direct the investments, which, by the way, need to be hundreds of millions of dollars, not not a few million, but we got to get started. So this is excellent to see.
Well, and I have a few questions along those lines, but I wanted to pause. You were talking about Larry Weber and on Iowa Press, and he was our keynote at the beginning of the week, and he talked about a series of recommendations.
Yeah.
And we got a question from one of our participants of, are there ideas about profitable uses for that 2-year floodplain that would support improving water quality to get crops out of there? And Larry was talking earlier in the week about the buyback and just getting out of that 2-year floodplain altogether. But I'm curious if there are ideas of using that smarter.
Well, for me, what we need to do, I believe, is we got to reverse the 70-year policy. The 70-year policy was basically trying to figure out how could we plant every single acre we could possibly find of corn and beans. And there's 2.5 million acres that are not really profitable doing that. So we got to figure out borrow a concept from real estate, highest and best use. What's the highest and best use of that acre? And maybe it's a wetland, maybe it's forest land, maybe it's a perennial of some sort, but it's not corn and beans, it's something else. And, that's where Theo and his group and others that are in that, CRP ground. I mean, pollinators are a huge issue here. What happens if we don't have any bees? I mean, that's going to be a big problem. So figure out what the highest and best use is for those acres, and let's reorient the Farm Bill to do that. A lot of where we are today is because of what the Farm Bill incentivizes farmers and landowners to do. So if we want different outcomes, change the Farm Bill.
Theo, I'm kind of curious your thoughts. You have the research farm with the Soybean Association. Are there things that you've been studying in this space? And it kind of a parallel question from Nicholas, one of our participants. There's no shortage of science and data and proposals. Are we looking to other countries or to other nations that it may be effective proposals that have been seen there as a way to get those implemented?
I guess on the first part of your question, we work with farmers where they're at. And so whether they're in the floodplain or not, they're going to be making the decision about where they plant and how they manage it. That's just the way this works to date. The policy piece that John talked about, that hasn't been a focus of our programs, particularly on farm research. But it doesn't mean that it's not a driver of land use decisions. There's the landowner and the operators that if they're one and the same, they're the ones that get to make the decisions about how they manage their land, and that's been the historical and current situation going on in this state and in this country. So I don't want to offer too many policy recommendations that are outside of my scope. Not to say that there aren't alternatives that could be explored on areas that don't have the greatest return. And if farmers are offered a system or a solution that provides them a greater return, then they will pursue it. There's a lot of inertia around growing corn and soybeans across the landscape in Iowa. There's billions of dollars of investment that have been made in making the land suitable for annual crop production, but also in creating crops and genetics in particular, and management strategies that allow for it to be done in a profitable way. And so that's where we're at. But if there are alternatives out there, and farmers or landowners, or if they're one and the same, are offered those options or can see a potential for return, then you'd see changes on the landscape.
Okay. Mike, John, kind of to that question, you've both talked about scalability, and I'm curious, you're kind of operating with those projects that are still to the whole picture. It's fantastic that 51, 150 projects. But John, even to your own, you said that's a drop in the bucket. I'm curious, how do you see getting this scalable, both from the number of hands that are working on it and planning, but also to the funding piece? How do you, is it a little bit at a time, or how do you see that scalability growing?
Mike, do you want to go, or do you want me to take a
Yeah,
while?
$1 million question, right? Absolutely. Yeah, I don't believe we're ever going to get there. We're not going to cost share our way to where we need to be. So we got to keep working on other strategies, and it's got to, from my perspective, I think about what drives anything we do. It's a market, right? So how are we going to develop a market that pushes us in the direction we need to go? And there's some steps being made. We're working with Iowa Soybean on a project right now where we're combining, we're paying a farmer to do some sort of a nutrient strategy on their land, and we're paying them up front to do that. And then we come back in and measure what those values are, both from a nutrient savings point of view and from a carbon sequestration point of view. There's big markets out there for there's market out there for carbon sequestration dollars or credits. And so that's an approach that I think needs a lot more exploration, and I think that has a key where you're paying for, you're paying a farmer to do something that's advantageous to soil health and advantageous to reducing nutrients, but also has a marketable value there for a carbon credit. So I think it's going to take a number of approaches, a portfolio of approaches, if you will. But we're going to have to move. We need more funding. Just like John mentioned, it's hundreds of millions of dollars, not millions of dollars, that's going to be needed.
I build on that, and I want to touch on what Mike just said and what Theo said before. Farmers and landowners are, I would argue, rational decision makers. So if we figure out some new things we want to pay them to do, and our public dollars are a big part, whether it's crop insurance or pandemic payments, trade payments, and so forth. We spend a lot of money supporting the system as it is today. But I would argue we need a new vision that's broader, that has to include, agricultural productivity is absolutely critical, but we need to figure out, if we got 100 acres, maybe 80 acres is corn and beans, or maybe even 90, but the other 10 is something else. And some of that might even be not what can we get per acre, what can we get per square foot in indoor farming. So I think Mike's point, we have a tremendous opportunity that's just starting to emerge with carbon markets. And remember, I went back and told you with the soil health is about getting more organic matter, more carbon into the soil. And when we do that, we take carbon out of the atmosphere, which people are paying to do right now. It's a global market. But the bigger value, I think, for Iowa is the carbon's going to help restore some of the fertility in the soil. And, we lose 10 times as much soil as we produce every year. So don't let anyone tell you that we fixed our erosion problem. It's a huge issue. Just go to any county and ask the county supervisors what they think about the erosion in the rivers, and they'll tell you about what that does to public infrastructure. And the Army Corps is concerned about what's happening to the reservoirs. So, but the opportunity is if we can begin to package with Theo's help and all the other people in the supply chain and begin to think across farms. So it's not every farm figures it out for themselves. And I'm not suggesting that we don't do anything other than voluntary. But what I think we need to do is we need to package farms around these other attributes, the water quality benefits, the flood mitigation, the water quality improvements. And people are going to pay, organizations, companies, I would argue in Iowa will actually pay more if they want to get rid of a ton of carbon and they want to show that on their corporate report, Hy-Vee, or I don't know, publicly traded company principal, not to name any names, John Deere, so forth. If we can deliver that carbon that ton of carbon and we drive it back into the soil. And oh, by the way, it does all these other great things to keep, Cedar Rapids from having another 100-year flood event, or maybe not so bad. That's where we can begin to capture the private market value of all these carbon dollars and do it really efficiently. So it's a packaging and it's part of a story. And Polk County, I want to do this with cover crops. What you just saw with the Blitz, I want to do that with cover crops. So the lady in Florida who's 94 and owns 1,000 acres, she doesn't have to figure out, she's not going to show up to a field day. She's not going to figure out cover crops, but if there's an operator who can do cover crops, she might be interested in participating.
Theo, I wanted to give you an opportunity on this as well. Obviously, the Soybean Association has been working with carbon sequestration, and I'm curious if there's anything you want to expand on there.
Well, I'm not an expert in carbon markets. The thing I'm actually, my background's in agronomy. So the thing that I see on the landscape, and I'd tell any farmer or landowner that's in the corn and soybean system, in particular for the corn or for the soybean part of the rotation, the best place to introduce cover crops is prior to soybeans. There's a window there to plant soybeans into living cereal rye and let that grow for that early part of the system. That also happens to be, usually not this year, but usually coincide with the majority of the water that leaves those fields through drainage tile, and having something growing there keeps those nutrients in the field, or at least a larger portion of them, and can provide weed control. The roots and the above ground portion of that cereal rye is capturing carbon and leaving it in the field. So, that's a low hanging fruit. That's millions of acres across Iowa that are growing soybeans, but they also have to get planted every year. So there's one project that we've worked on is trying to support cover crop businesses. So businesses that can provide those services. Traditionally, farmers have tried to scale up their equipment or tried to find the equipment to plant their acres. And so we've had a project that's helped provide business planning to farmers that want to get into the cover crop seeding business. And so small scale, but it can have an impact. If a farmer has idle equipment and they can find a way to help their neighbors get that planted on acres that are going to soybeans or corn, but soybeans are the place where you get the most growth and the biggest opportunity for growth in the current corn soybean rotation that dominates the landscape. Then that's a good place to start. So you can drive around any part of this state, you can see fields that don't have it, and they could be using it. And it's a matter of logistics. It's a matter of the farmers, either through a combination of public and private resources, making that investment. And then what we're trying to do is also on the research side is continue to gather information that's relevant to farmers and the people who are making those decisions, and say, hey, this is what you gain from it. Here are the people who are doing this in your area. Talk to them about how they're making it work, and encouraging that to happen. So in particular on the soybean side, that's something that I think we'll continue to see expansion of through a combination of the incentives, like the carbon incentives, or the public cost share that's more traditional, or through private investment. There's places in the state, Mitchell County is one of them, Washington County is another one, where you have pretty widespread adoption of cover crops as a practice. And that's because of the public investments that were made there, but also ongoing investments by the farmers who see the benefits of those practices. And they're looking at it from both a nutrient and water quality, the effect on nutrient loss and water quality, but also they're seeing other things that they like, including weed control, field trafficability, and also the carbon and nutrient cycling that occurs when that happens. So it's a target-rich environment. Whatever it takes to get people to try it and have success with it, so that they're not, they're not seeing a yield loss. If you think about soybeans being at their current prices, it doesn't take much of a yield loss to result in, a large loss, potential, a large income loss if things don't get managed correctly. So people need to have a plan. They need to have the resources to do it. They need to have the expertise to manage it well. And if they're successful with it, and there's places in the state where people are making it happen, then we can see more of that on the landscape.
Okay. I know I have a question, and I know we're running tight on time, but wouldn't funding of the Iowa Water and Land Trust Fund greatly help with these efforts in terms of getting to the hundreds of millions of dollars of investment that's needed per year? Thoughts on that? That's a political question, obviously.
I think they would. I think that
Sure.
is an important source of
Yep.
funding.
There's
Yeah.
another bucket that could be, another
Yeah.
bucket of funding that could help further this along. Absolutely. Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Um,
I'm sorry.
I guess the current situation we have on the landscape is a reflection of public policy. If people are interested in IWIL or some other policy change, that's a reflection of the legislature and the priorities of their constituents. So I'll leave it at that.
I want to just follow up on Theo's point, though. I think that he made a really good one in terms of the cover crops and the risks inherent with changing practices. And so one of the things we have to figure out in coming up with these systems approaches to cover crops, and Polk County, I'm wanting to go to 50,000 acres by 2030. And if I could wave my magic wand, 100,000 by 2035, set some targets. And how will we do that? Well, we're going to do it, I think, with teams and a market-based approach. And Montgomery County has, I think, a good model that we could build off of that would add some targeting, and building those teams around operators who have experience with the cover crops. And then we have to maybe build in some financial tools to help people get over. Sometimes there's a yield drag, but you go talk to people like Wade Fredericks, who's been doing cover crops up in Mitchell County that Theo mentioned. I mean, there are all sorts of benefits of getting those cover crops established in terms of the production, both the consistency of the yield and the ability to manage water stress. So it's getting people, I think, over the hump, and then having a system it's permanent. So it's not somebody tries cover crops once, they have a bad experience, and then they don't do it again. We don't want that to happen.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate the insights from each of you. We've hit the time window of the panel. To John, to Mike, and to Theo, thank you very much. I know there's a lot of ground, bad pun, but there's still a lot of ground to cover in this topic. And so it's not one that we will ease up in covering anytime soon. And I want to thank everyone for taking part in participating in today's panel. Just a quick reminder, this closes our in-depth week for water quality. We will have many more panels at Iowa Ideas, which is our annual conference. Is scheduled for October 14th and 15th. It's online, it's free, and we have 9 different tracks of topics like this that we will take up there. Anyone that's interested in participating, you do have to register, and that can be done at iowaideas.com. To everyone, I just want to say thank you and have a great weekend.
Thanks.
Thanks much.